I'm James Mann. I'm an author in residence and fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I'm here with Charles Gati, also from Johns Hopkins SAIS, my good colleague, and we're here to talk about the life and the career of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was himself a member of the Foreign Policy Institute for many years at SAIS, and one of America's most prominent officials in foreign policy. Charles is the editor of a leading book on Mr. Brzezinski's achievements and his career. So I wanted to start by asking Charles, when did you personally first meet Brzezinski? Where were you and what was he like back then?
Well, we met in 1970 in New York at Columbia University. Earlier that year I had applied for a fellowship at his institute, which at that time was called the Research Institute on International Change. Well, that was the subsequent title. At that time, actually, it was called Research Institute on Communist Affairs. And there were about maybe a dozen research fellows there writing books and articles and having discussions. And so it was a fairly informal arrangement. I wrote him a letter, introduced myself, and he accepted me.
Let me go back a little bit in his career because I wonder whether he talked about this at Columbia. He was part of a new group of academics who moved into and out of work for the government quite often. Did he talk about that?
No, he did not talk, certainly not to me. What I knew at the time about his pre-1970 life and achievements were his books. In graduate school, I read, or should I say I had to read, at least one of his books. I think to this day I believe it was his best scholarly book called The Soviet Bloc. It came out in 1960. I was then a PhD student and I read that. I also read one or two other books and several articles that he published in Foreign Affairs in particular, but maybe also in Foreign Policy magazine. But I did not know about his ambitions. I learned much later how he moved over from Harvard to Columbia and so on.
I will say that's something we share. As an undergraduate, I was assigned to read a terrific book by him about the Soviet Union and about totalitarianism. Did he mention he had been, over the years, both a colleague and friend and sometime competitor with Henry Kissinger? Did he ever talk about that in those days?
Well, not in those days. Mind you, I was, compared to him, a very, very junior scholar. So personal conversations, we had a few. I remember a few of those, especially the one where I believe that he got interested in me. At a luncheon meeting, Romania was a subject. And he had, I don't remember anymore the substance of that dialogue or debate, but I do know that I said something very different from what he said. And in that setting, I guess he was not used to it, but he welcomed it very much. So after that, he came over to my office, and he didn't sit down, but he was standing there, I would say, for almost an hour, arguing the case, trying to convince me that he was right and I was wrong, which was one of his qualities. But on the other hand, he appeared to respect me very much for having a view, even though it was different from his. Or perhaps because it was different from.
So did you see at Columbia what kind of teacher and professor Brzezinski was?
Definitely. Well, in two ways. One is that he had these luncheons and some other seminars where I was invited, and I was there as a participant, but it was not for students. But I also, of course, met students, including his research assistant, who turned out to be my wife years later. That is in that institute where I met my future wife, who was one of his students. So as we met and as I talked to her and some other students, I found out that he was extremely respected, even by those who disagreed with him, because he was precise, he was well prepared, extremely knowledgeable, and his way of phrasing issues was clear. Students loved that. I am not sure that they loved him or what kind of emotional reaction he had with them, probably not particularly deep, except for one thing, and that is, I never met a professor like that. When he gave somebody an A, which was not that often, it was not just an A, but a personal handwritten note to the students why they got an A and how pleased he was with their performance. And since my future wife got an A, we still have in our apartment, in our home, we still have Brzezinski's letter to her.
How did he find time to write? This is a question I always wonder with academics. I'm an author, I spend my working days writing or doing research. I can't imagine having the teaching schedule that he had. He was a prolific author.
A prolific author. I don't have a particularly profound answer to your good question, but I think two things. I don't think he slept very much, which helps. He didn't need it. The other one was that he was a very fast writer. Just like his lectures, I know that you heard him talk. He spoke in perfect paragraphs, even when he just had a few words in outline for whatever he was addressing. But it could be printed, as is pretty much. Well, this is the source of success. I am, for example, a writer who rewrites everything half a dozen times before I'm really satisfied. I don't believe this was the case with Zbig. I believe his first draft, or perhaps his second draft, was the last draft.
You shared something with him. You had both been born in and came from Eastern Europe. And we know from the files and from one of the chapters in your book that there were certain tensions that he had with what I would call the old WASP of American foreign policy. People like the Bundys and the Harrimans. He even had a kind of a testy exchange with Harriman at one point. Did he ever talk about those feelings with you?
Yes, yes. Maybe not at the beginning, but later on, sure. We did have that connection. He was born in Poland, I was born in Hungary, and it so happened that he liked Hungarians, and I still do, Poles, with all the national faults that I have written about and could discuss, and so could he. Yes, this was definitely a subject of many, many conversations of how, I'll come to your question in just a moment, how, what was the difficult part of Polish and Hungarian history, particularly towards minorities. And the whole Jewish question, which in Eastern Europe was, and to a lesser extent perhaps, remains an issue. And he and I have spent many, many hours over many years discussing that. But to go back to your question, how does somebody with an East European background and an East European accent break into the American foreign policy establishment? This is a big, big issue, and it did not happen, from one day to the next, but over several years. Henry Kissinger, though German, or Hal Sonnenfeld, also German, but they became pioneers in that respect, and then so did Zbig. They did have to put up with a lot of bad feelings, particularly Zbig, because his Polish Catholicism created doubts and suspicion in the minds of the foreign policy establishment. The example that you are alluding to was with the former governor of New York, Averell Harriman, also ambassador to Moscow at some point, and a foundational element in the foreign policy elite. And once Zbig found out that Harriman questioned his qualifications to deal with the Soviet Union, that was on the eve of, or I think at the eve of his joining the Carter administration in 1976-77. And so he wrote him a letter, which is reprinted, a brash, strong letter, not that aggressive, but certainly not that peaceful either, saying, in effect, that if Kissinger can deal with Middle Eastern issues, and he, a capitalist, can deal with the Soviet Union. Harriman is qualified to do that, then so can he as a Polish, or as a Polish, I forgot how he phrased it, Polish or Polish Catholic. It was a real put down, but the nice thing about it is, at that time politics was still a little more civilized than it is today, that Harriman was probably offended by the letter, but he saw that Brzezinski had a point, and so he invited him for lunch, and they became friends for years thereafter. It's an amazing story about the foreign policy elite and its ability to embrace people from abroad. How the once white, Protestant, and rich foreign policy elite gave way to a diverse group of people.
And in fact, sort of the next step in Brzezinski's career in the 70s is that he helps form something called the Trilateral Commission, which students of foreign policy think of as now as part of the establishment. But here it's Brzezinski who helps form it.
With Rockefeller.
With David Rockefeller.
David Rockefeller,
yeah.
Yes.
And does he talk about this commission? I don't know whether he takes time away from Columbia for it, or whether it's another thing that he just does on the side.
It's another thing. There was another office, another very small staff there. The top staffer at the Trilateral Commission then moved with him to the White House and became his chief of staff. Yeah.
Well, and he starts to get active in politics, and as a Democrat, the first leader that he works for is Hubert Humphrey. Let me back up. At Columbia, I mean, you guys are friends. Did you talk politics much?
Well, occasionally I knew, and I was hoping that he would tie up with Humphrey, because I liked Humphrey myself. But he had a choice, as he subsequently explained to me several times, of all the Democratic foreign policy leaders. Muskie wanted him to work for him, and they were on good terms. I mean, two Polish Americans, you might say. Okay, so they were maybe not temperamentally, but otherwise very compatible. There was Scoop Jackson. They were not compatible. Some agreement, particularly how to deal with the Soviet Union, but otherwise, I think they met. I don't know that actually. I'm just guessing. And there were two or three others at that time running for president or leaders of the foreign policy establishment on the Democratic side, and they all wanted Zbig to work with them. And it's not only because he was brilliant and his knowledge wide-ranging, but he had at least one, and probably many other qualities that few people had, certainly few academics, maybe no other academic: the ability to express himself concisely. People running for the presidency, they have no time. And so he could do a half a page. That would be one, and concisely express what the other guy needed to know. The other thing was that he had time, and it's probably even you don't know, he had time to answer mail all the time. I found a little letter from him from 1968, when we did not know each other. We might have met once, but we did not know each other. And I had my first substantive article in an academic quarterly called World Politics, published at Princeton University. I was extremely proud of that. I was a young scholar. And I sent it to him. And believe it or not, I got an answer. I said, we didn't know each other. And I just wrote, I thought you might be interested in this. And he read it, and he had one or two sentences there actually fairly critical of what I had written, handwritten. And so then I talked to somebody else who knew him better, that already in the late 60s and in the early 70s, he cultivated people, not just a junior scholar like me, but especially important people, and corresponded with them.
So then he has this relationship with leading national politicians, but the one that he forms a tie with is this unknown governor from Georgia who happens to be on the Trilateral Commission. So what was it about Jimmy Carter that brought Brzezinski to him?
Complicated question. I think one thing was that Carter was very impressed by him at the Trilateral Commission, which was run efficiently. I mean, in the academic world, almost nothing is ever run efficiently. But Zbig had that ability to run things efficiently. I think Carter liked that in him. I think he liked the precise, concise, and very, very brief education that he got from Zbig in the Trilateral Commission. Thirdly, I think the very substance of the Trilateral Commission appealed to Carter. He wanted to have a kind of basically global and largely or almost exclusively democratic response to the global issues of the day. And in effect, it was Rockefeller and especially Brzezinski who dreamt this up. And I think he was also impressed by his knowledge. Carter once wrote, I think it's in my book, the preface of the book, that aside from his wife, his preferred companion on any of the foreign trips was Brzezinski. He always insisted on Brzezinski sitting next to him. Because he says, I learned more during those few hours than at other times.
So Carter is elected, Brzezinski becomes his national security advisor, and he puts together a staff. And I have to say, as a writer of modern history, it's amazing how many prominent people passed through or served on that staff. Whether it was Robert Gates, I even discovered that there was some young Army colonel named Colin Powell who Brzezinski tried to court for a job. Do you want to say something about the people who were on that staff?
For sure, some from the academic world, which was unusual, I think, for those positions. Some staffers he had run into, and it was a very small staff. It was like most of the time, he was around 40 people only. Compare this to today when it's well into the hundreds then. And the staff was extraordinarily loyal to him. I do know, I think probably all of them or nearly all of them. And I have talked to them about him. And the kind of loyalty that they felt towards him is, I think, unparalleled in Washington. Where the digs are more common and the competition, etc. He made them work very hard. There was nothing chummy about him. It wasn't that he was so likable and friendly. It was just that he told them what he expected, and if they delivered, he was very, very understanding and even kind. One example is that as if he were still a professor, he asked them to submit at the end of every day, when they were at work, every day, a one-pager about what they had done, what question they might have, And believe it or not, he read all of them at night, and then first thing in the morning, which was usually at 6 o'clock, with his marginal comments, the page was returned to the staffer.
So I think that that staff included one future Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, right? One future CIA director, that was Gates.
Yes.
And a future director of the National Security Agency, Bill Odom.
Correct, yes. He was his best friend.
And he had a story, I think, that I'd like you to tell about a phone call from Bill Odom one night.
Well, one night at 3 o'clock in the morning, or at night, the telephone rang. It's a special telephone at Brzezinski's home in Virginia, and it was General Odom, who was in charge of these things, saying that we believe that an attack by the Soviet Union is imminent on the United States. And I would not like to be awakened with that kind of phone call, but he was. And so again, a sign of how his mind works, how well organized he was. He knew what to ask and what to say, and the essence of that was go back and find out for sure that this is happening before I call the president, because that was his job, to alert the president, of course. So he did not immediately call President Carter, but waited for another call. And it turned out that a computer issue created the warning or the problem, and in point of fact, there was no attack on the United States. The way I'm describing it, it seems fairly simple, but all this put that into a 25-minute period, or maybe a 20-minute period, which is all he had to contemplate the situation, decide what to do, when to call the president, and what kind of directive he should pass on to the president as to what to do in response.
Now, he developed during that period and before it a reputation as a real Cold Warrior, very hard line on the Soviets. Was it accurate? What was your impression?
Well, yes and no. He had, if hard lines meant at the time that you don't expect the Soviet Union under American patronage or influence to become a Western-style democracy, well then yes, he was a hardliner. He knew history, and he knew that Russia or the Soviet Union would remain more or less what it was. It could be influenced, and it certainly ought to be contained. He was a fan of containment. He was not a fan of Republican propaganda about the rollback of Soviet power. He never supported that. He never even understood it very well, what in the 1950s, particularly the Secretary of State Dulles had meant by that. So in that sense, he was. In another sense, though, he wanted to engage the Soviet Union in a competitive relationship. In other words, if the choice was confrontation, competition, or cooperation, I would say he was between cooperation and competition, and not confrontation, if possible. The best example for that was his outreach to China, or continued Kissinger's and Nixon's outreach to China, about which you know a lot more than I do. A second example was his program before he became an SC advisor, an article in Foreign Affairs in 1961, and then a subsequent book called Alternative to Partition, where he advocated a policy of outreach to Eastern Europe, not just to the people of Eastern Europe, but the officials as well, to the extent possible, like academics, so they could travel, academic exchange, which he favored. So yes, he wanted to moderate the Soviet-type systems, but I don't think he had any illusions about the possibility of overthrowing them.
Was the purpose of this outreach to Eastern European governments to see if you could create a distance between them and?
Yes. Yes, to drive a wedge between them and the Soviet Union, sure. That was part of that. Yes, he wanted to weaken the Soviet Union. I wouldn't call that Cold Warrior. A Cold Warrior wants to bomb them. He never wanted to rely extensively on the military instrument of foreign policy. That was not Brzezinski at all. And so, to some extent, the charge that he was a Cold Warrior, I think, is mistaken. Now, it is true that his suspicion towards the Soviet Union, towards even Russia, which partly comes from his Polish background, as it comes from my Hungarian background. Well, certainly, but I think we were right. We were to have suspicion and not naively see a competitor push its ideas and ideals around the world.
We should add one other part of the same way of thinking, which was not top of the news then, but becomes very important later on, which is he's usually credited with being the driving force for seeing if the the Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union could be in some way distanced from people in Moscow, to create a little bit of Islamic nationalism there.
This is true. This is true. He saw at that time, not after the Cold War so much, but at that time he saw nationalism, especially in that part of the world, including in Central Asia, but also in China, by the way. He saw a way to curtail Soviet ambitions. He was relying even on communist Poland to some extent, thinking that no Polish leader can be totally subservient. I am exaggerating now, he never said it in these words, but he thought that Polish nationalism, even under communism, was a positive force.
Tell me about his relationship with the Pope.
That was very good, very, very good. They spoke in Polish, they spoke on the telephone quite often. I'm talking about a period when he was in the late 70s, before the introduction of martial law in Poland. The Soviet Union, or the Soviet leadership, decided that the elevation of the Polish Pope was done by Zbigniew Brzezinski, that he wanted to have an anti-communist Polish Pope at the Vatican. Well, that's not how it works, but the Soviets convinced that they like conspiracies. They still do. And they're not the only ones who like it, but they like conspiracies. So they decided that it was all Brzezinski's doing. And of course, the Pope heard this story as well. So it's against this background that the good story comes, which is that Brzezinski went to see the Pope, and after a long discussion, the Pope said, well, enjoy the conversation, please come back as soon as possible, we'll have to continue. And Brzezinski, who otherwise was not all that modest, but in the presence of the Pope, he was, and he said, well, I don't know, Your Eminence, that's too much, I was just here, I cannot just sit on a plane and come back again to see you, much as I would like to. And the Pope responded, oh yes, you can. After all, you elected me to be the Pope, so you can come back anytime you want. They did have an excellent relationship.
And on China, my impression was he saw China almost entirely through a Soviet lens. And I mean, there's certainly a strand of American military thinking that went beyond Brzezinski, that the American relationship with China required the Soviet Union to station military divisions in Asia that would otherwise have been available for Eastern Europe.
Well, this is one area where many years later, not while he was in the White House, we had discussions and disagreements. This was a political friendship unlike any other. And as you suggested, he had understandably, as an NSC advisor, he had a broader perspective, or a global perspective, or a geopolitical perspective, call it what you will. And he wanted to not only continue the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China, but he wanted to deepen it. And Carter went along with that very much. And so despite what you might call broadly human rights violations, it's a lot more than that, or the undemocratic nature of China, he thought, and I think most of the foreign policy establishment agreed, minus you perhaps, that there was more to it than another ally against the Soviet Union. But the Chinese did help. I know that there were intelligence operations from China into the Soviet Union that we could not have done any other way. So it was very helpful to limit, to deepen hostility between China and the Soviet Union, and also to weaken the Soviet reach. So he believed that and pursued it vigorously. The State Department, some people there did not quite like it. They wanted a more balanced approach that would be not, so that we would not have warmer relations with China than with the Soviet Union. Some people like Vance and Holbrooke, they wanted détente with the Soviet, and Marshall Schulman, perhaps in particular, who was Vance's Soviet advisor, and his colleague and my colleague from Columbia University, that is Brzezinski's colleague. Well, they wanted a different approach, somewhat similar to both great powers, but Carter and Brzezinski went the other way.
Yeah, we've been talking until just your last answer as though there's just the National Security Council making foreign policy and just Brzezinski, but there is a State Department run by Cyrus Vance, and they had a relationship that certainly gets characterized regularly, both by reporters at the time and by historians, as a very testy relationship. Also to that, and Vance may have, to Brzezinski, symbolized the old elite that he'd been battling with since.
Well, that's, I don't know about that part, but I can tell you that Brzezinski did not feel that his relationship with Vance was as bad as the press described it. And the press got the leads at the time, the information, primarily from State Department types. I don't know if from Vance, I doubt that it was directly from Vance, but from some of the people who worked there. They like to leak, and they, primarily because of China, but also because of Brzezinski's proximity to the president and the president's reliance on him and not the State Department. There was a bureaucratic conflict, understandable. And on China, there was the Assistant Secretary, Richard Holbrooke, who did not work well with Brzezinski. They were both very strong and with definite and well-formed ideas, and so Brzezinski, whenever he had a chance, tried to squeeze him out of the diplomatic relationship with China.
So you had been with him at Columbia. Did you ever see him when he moved to the National Security Council, to the Carter administration?
Yes, but we did exchange a couple of letters, no emails yet at the time. But I was in much closer contact with General Odom, who was his military attaché or military aide. And the title does not quite describe his proximity to Brzezinski on Soviet affairs and Soviet military affairs. of which General Odom was an acknowledged expert and student. Anyway, we had known each other at Columbia University and became friendly. I came to Washington to see Odom, and he came out of his office and said, I need another 10 or 15 minutes, would you mind waiting? So I sat down somewhere there near his office, and what do I see but Brzezinski walk by. I didn't want to, frankly, bother him. I mean, you know, I didn't have anything significant to add then, or I wasn't shy. I was just not aggressive to seek him out. So he looks at me. He says, "Well, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I am waiting for Bill. Came down to see him." He says, "Well, how come you didn't come to see me?" I said, "Well, I didn't want to bother you. You had other things or better things to do than meeting me." He says, "Oh, no, I'd actually like to talk to you. How long, when is your meeting with Bill?" I said, "I don't know." So he went in there and asked Bill Odom when he's going to see me or when we're going to talk. Soon after that, he made time, and I was for an hour in his office. There was an issue dealing with Eastern Europe that he wanted to discuss with me. And it was more questions by him, even at that point when I was just a teacher, a professor, and he was the NSC advisor. But he was very open-minded, and it wasn't that he lectured me, nothing further from the truth. He just wanted to have my input and wondered why I had not contacted him when I was coming down to see our mutual friend Bill Odom.
So one more question about the Carter administration. You get 3 years into the Carter administration, and the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And Jimmy Carter has been pretty much on the side of détente in the policy debates and comes down with a series of measures against the Soviet Union so tough that most people who look at the Reagan administration say that they actually continued rather than initiated a bunch of Soviet policies.
Well, the most hurtful actually was canceling American participation at the Moscow Olympics.
Right.
The Soviets were more troubled by that than anything else, in my opinion.
Did you see those measures as Brzezinski the driving force for those measures?
I don't have the inside information. I can't answer that question because I don't know, and I have not asked him about that, of who, said what and so on. What I can say, and which may be of some interest, is that President Reagan was very impressed by Brzezinski. At one point, they had a game going on, a very serious military game.
Oh, a war game?
A war game.
Okay.
And the question was, who would play the president? And Reagan recommended Brzezinski. It did not work out that way because he was wondering, in a Republican administration.
He couldn't play a Republican?
Well, he has voted Republican over the years. I do happen to know that. I mean, mostly Democrat, but a couple of times Republican in presidential races too, not Reagan. Well, maybe the second time he did vote for Reagan. I don't know, never asked him. Certainly not when.
I think the one where he at least some of his staff, and probably he abandoned the Democrats, was Dukakis.
Definitely. That's the one I know. He voted for the first Bush administration.
I got ahead of myself a little because I want to ask, you get to the end of the Carter administration, and Brzezinski, like everybody else, is suddenly faced with the reality that Carter will not have a second term. So he has to find something to do with his life.
Well, he did have a tenured job at Columbia. The system that applied at Harvard, that you come back in 2 years or forget it, did not apply to the best of my knowledge at Columbia. So he was able to come back, and he did. But curiously enough, his reputation, which I never totally figured out, his reputation at Columbia by the faculty was not as good as it should have been. And so they didn't treat him as well as he expected. So that was one thing. The other one was the family was already set in Washington, so it was a commute. I remember the commute because he would come down and spend one night in New York, and often had dinner in our house. We lived near Columbia University at the time. And I remember his suitcase when I would see him in the elevator arriving from Washington. So it was a tiring process of every week commuting. But mainly it was, they just didn't respect him enough by my standards. So then came an offer from our school, School of Advanced International Studies. And so he taught here for more than a decade. He also had an association with CSIS, which after retiring from SICE became the only association. But in any case, he wrote a major book about his experiences in the Carter administration that was quite well.
You mean his memoir?
Power and Principle.
Yeah.
That was well received.
During this period, when he's in the Carter administration and just after, how many kids does he have? How old are they?
Well, he has 3 kids. The one that today's generation of Americans knows best is Miko Brzezinski, of course, with the television star on the Morning Joe show, whom I met when she back I think in 70 or 71. I think she was just born, I think, or maybe 2-3 years old. I don't remember exactly. 2 sons. Ian is the oldest one, Ian Brzezinski, who served in the second Bush administration at the Pentagon. Worked with Paul Wolfowitz, I know very closely, and he's a Republican. The other son, Mark Brzezinski, is a Democrat and was recently U.S. ambassador. Obama sent him there in Sweden. But he has had other positions as well in Democratic administration. So I joked with Zbigniew Brzezinski that he prepared his own future, that whether the Democrats run this country or the Republicans, there will be a son who will uphold his father's reputation, that is to say, Zbig's. And actually, once I introduced him as a man who has a Republican son, a Democratic son, and now at least nominally independent television star, so his legacy is assured. And he said, what you forgot was my dog, who will bark whenever they don't do the right thing.
So he's at SICE and teaching as he had at Columbia. And meanwhile, he doesn't exactly stay aloof from larger international issues. He's active in foreign policy. What, at the time of the end of the Cold War, you knew him then. What is he?
I knew him then very well. We traveled together even to Moscow, and our friendship deepened at the time. We talked on the phone a lot before I moved to Washington. He felt fulfilled. And he said this later on, maybe wrote it too, that his greatest achievement was his contribution to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism. Yeah, he felt very good, and like most of us, probably too optimistic about the future.
I think the new republics, particularly Ukraine, established a lot of contact with him and looked to. I think I ran into him around Washington with Ukrainian officials. He was advising some of the new republics, was he not?
I don't know about that. It's very likely that you are right. I do know that his schedule was constantly full of officials He was no longer part of any administration, but prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers from the former Soviet republics, especially the Baltic states, and of course Poland and Ukraine, as you say, were constantly in the office. They gave him a lot of credit for ideas that undermined Soviet control over the former Soviet republics.
There's one more episode in his life that I want to go over with you, and that is, here is Brzezinski, known to the country as a hawk, hardliner. That's his reputation. That's his image. So we get to 2001, 2002, and the question with the George W. Bush administration is, what should we do with vis-a-vis Iraq and Saddam Hussein again? And what does Brzezinski say and do at that point?
Well, this was a very important turning point in his life. I do know quite a bit, probably not nearly everything about it, but what I do know is that the three of us, General Odom, Brzezinski, and myself, every couple of weeks usually, had our lunch near a CSIS office, which at that time was on K Street. And the main proponent of opposing American military intervention was General Odom, which is interesting because he was an anti-Soviet hawk, far more than Brzezinski. And he was a military man, and in the minds of many people in Washington and elsewhere, he was a military interventionist. Nothing could be further from the truth. He had opposed the Vietnam War, which both Brzezinski and myself supported too long, not till the very end maybe, but too long. To this day, he felt embarrassed by it, and I have very great regrets myself. In any case, then came the Iraq thing, and the question was not whether Brzezinski opposed the war there, the military intervention. He did. The question was, would he go public with it, and the consequences of doing that. You know, once you are part of the foreign policy elite, the establishment, you are on a track. And you know, as Kissinger said, actually in an exchange with Brzezinski way back, you know, you try to be as much as possible in the center. In order to be respected, you are in the center of the foreign policy establishment. There was little or no question about disagreeing with the Bush administration's growing commitment to military intervention. This was not easy because of at least two things, but maybe it's one of the, it's the same thing, and that is that you know, Brzezinski in particular was very friendly with many of the Republican policymakers, notably Paul Wolfowitz, who was the dean before that here at SAIS. The establishment expects you to be in the middle, in the mainstream, and if you are different, then can you get back, or would you be thought of as an extremist or as not one of us? It's in every political order, you know, there are certain unwritten rules about following a particular path. And Brzezinski was a respected member of the foreign policy community, despite the fact that some, the more liberal Democrats, thought that he was too hawkish against the Soviet Union. But he decided to go public, and he became the single most important voice in opposition to the war in Iraq. And he was not alone, of course. There was, curiously enough, in the older Bush's national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, also spoke out against the Iraq war. There were not enough voices to speak out because the Democrats felt intimidated that if they oppose the war, then they will be judged as soft abroad and isolationists or whatever, and they caved. It was a very sad spectacle, and Brzezinski was very upset by that. And he was encouraged primarily by General Odom to go public. I emphasize that because people would not assume that a general of the army and such a hawk on the Soviet Union would be for a peaceful resolution of the Iraq War.
When he was at SAIS, besides teaching, he gathered a lot of people around him. Tell me about his lunch group.
Lots of people wanted to come. His request was that you come to all the sessions. It was every second Tuesday. Some people came every time, some people didn't. That kind of bothered him, but it's an interesting thing. Two things I want to say about it. One is how masterfully he ran these sessions. He had a speaker with whom he either agreed or did not agree necessarily. And he had the first comment on the speaker, which I made fun of because he always said the same thing, thanking the speaker for the comprehensive, wide-ranging discussion, which meant absolutely nothing because that's what he always said. And he liked it when I made fun of him, by the way, because he knew that it was affectionate. After the first question, he allowed everybody to say something. And he knew everybody in the group by name. And people who otherwise, I know, disliked him were very eager to be included in the group, and they kept coming. They did respect him for the wide-ranging discussion that he encouraged. The other thing is, though, how disciplined he was. If at the end of an academic year, he found out that somebody came only 2 or 3 times instead of, let's say, 12 or 14 sessions, he did not invite that person back the next year. So you had to be there and be an active participant to deserve to be invited. And people understood that, and I think kind of liked it too.
So overall, in this long life, he seemed like a fairly happy guy? Was he happy to be in the United States? Was he happy how his life turned out?
Well, he was, like many immigrants, an idealist about the United States. He had disappointments. 1956 was a disappointment. He wanted to believe the rhetoric of liberation and rollback, but when things moved against the Soviet Union in Poland, and then especially in Hungary, the US did nothing. And so then he moved towards peaceful engagement, which was a response to the disappointment of 1956. And then he had a broader disappointment. He missed in this country, I'm not talking about domestic issues, that's an altogether different field, but just foreign policy, is long-term planning, strategic thinking. This was his thing. He considered himself, and Kissinger, a strategic thinker who would look not at today's events, and not even necessarily next week, but to look at the global scene and think ahead. And he hoped against hope, I think, for a long time, that the United States was capable of doing this. And I think towards the end of his life, he began to understand reluctantly that this is not the American way, that this is a very pragmatic society and a pragmatic polity, where if you get something done tomorrow, that's already a long-term step. So I think this would be his regrets. But he was American beyond, I think, today's comprehension. He did say once that when he became a US citizen, which was, I think, I checked that, I think 1958, and the judge asked him, would he like to change his name, which was my case too. When I became a U.S. citizen, it's customary for the judge to ask, would you like to change your name? And I asked him that question too. I was surprised because it's so hard to pronounce his name if you're not Polish. And so he said, no, I don't, because this is the only country where a man named Zbigniew Brzezinski can make a name for himself. And so I think that showed the kind of love that he had for, and appreciation that he had for this country. Disappointments aside, he remained totally committed to the idea that the United States is the only country that can shape a global order and a better world.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure.